well.
Okay. So for those of you who haven't met me, I'm Robbie Wagner. Kind of running these meetups now by default because everyone else that was running them left. Yep. If anyone's interested in helping run these in the future, definitely looking for help. So let me know. I work for a consultancy that I just started, ShipShape. So if you need any help or questions about Ember, hit me up. Last thing I'm going to plug is we just announced Ember Cares today, which is a Ember cancer awareness thing. So just go to embercares.com. You can buy some swag, and all the proceeds go to Cancer Research Institute. So let's also thank Power Options for hosting us, obviously. Yeah. And that's all from me. Go ahead and let Brian get started.
So, our main talk today is, and if anyone has any lightning talks, if you want to volunteer for afterwards, we are open for that as well. But our main talk is about maintainable UI testing with Ember. And this talk is actually adapted from an article that I wrote on the Ember Way in May, and there's a link to that in the slides, which are also available on GitHub if you want to check everything out later. And so, oh wow, do you not have color emojis? That's too bad. Okay, so with any talk about Ember that is dealing with testing, I think it's important to kind of go over some of the basic terminology that is testing specific and Ember specific. Ember gives us, Ember gives us different kind of tests. It gives us unit testing, which is pretty similar to any sort of unit testing you'll do anywhere. It's focused, so it involves really just pulling in like a single piece of your application. Usually it's like usually it's just a function, but it could be a model, a service, a component, just any sort of piece of your Ember application, and kind of testing that in an isolated way. They're very fast and isolated, as mentioned, and it's very conducive to functional programming because oftentimes you're pulling in a single function and you're just you're not worried about side effects, and you're worried about just testing inputs and getting outputs. So just attacking the different inputs, seeing what happens, making sure something equals an exact value that you're expecting. They're really convenient for testing small parts of your application. But things get a little more complicated when you're actually testing components. And that's where typically Ember gives us something called integration testing. So you have a component that is, right now it's JavaScript and HTML. Some people think of a component as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but in Ember we have a component that we have a template and we have a component file. And it's not necessarily something that, well, you can do component unit testing, but it's often better to take it and see how does this component render in the DOM. And that's really what component tests focus on. It's an important distinction, I think, to know that within an integration test, you're not necessarily running the entire app. So you're seeing how a component renders in the DOM, but you're not quite booting up the app. You're not running a lot of initializers. You're not creating a bunch of states. You can inject services and inject different things into your component. So there are ways to get a little more advanced and sort of simulate an app, but it's also a step below that, I would say, in terms of just overall complexity and speed. And it may also involve other components. So there are a lot of good patterns out there around stubbing components and then passing that to the component that you're testing. And there's a lot more, and especially in what is, I think, very good documentation that Ember has on this. And so last but not least is acceptance testing. It's probably the largest form of testing. It's also the slowest form of testing. So it's something that you won't be doing as much as unit testing probably. You probably won't be doing as much as component testing, but it's meant to test entire pages of your application, sometimes multiple pages, but it ultimately involves running the full app. You're running initializers, you're generating state, you're simulating different parts of, or you're creating different data often, and like I said, you're rendering entire pages. And one of the best ways that I heard exceptions testing described to me was like, you're telling a story. So you're going through and you're saying that, if I'm reading an acceptance test, it should be documenting, it should be something that I think, even if you're not a developer, you can go and you can read it and say, I'm a user, I'm going to click on this button, and all of a sudden, all these, two other elements might be visible. Something might have a certain class on it. And then I'm going to click on another button, and then this might happen. And it often involves, whereas a unit test might involve one single assertion, I find that an acceptance test can have, it's not uncommon to have like a whole list of assertions. So it's definitely a lot bigger scope-wise. And it opens itself up to a lot more just unique parts of the app in general. So these are the three things that Ember gives us. And what do I mean when I say user interface testing? Mainly, I consider user interface testing to be some combination of integration testing and acceptance testing. Things that involve the DOM, things that involve interacting with the DOM, things that somebody might see at some point from the user standpoint. And so also, what is maintainability? I think a lot of times when we think of maintainability, we think of, how do I write my code maintainably? How is somebody going to come into my code later and understand what's going on? How am I going to come into my code later and understand what's going on? Is it documented properly? Is it kind of encapsulated enough or abstracted enough from other parts of the code? I think we often talk maintainability sometimes in terms of architecture, and that's another thing that Ember gives us when we add a component. Is this component going into the right place in the application? Is it going to the right file space? And so when we talk about maintainable testing, it really, to me, I think just the way that I like to sum it up is making sure you're testing the right things, but also making sure you're continuing to test the right things. So it's kind of that balancing act of not just having the right approach, but sort of having a clearly defined set of tools and methods that you can go to reliably. And as your application changes, you can just, you're not giving up, essentially. I find that sometimes if you don't have a clear testing strategy, you can really write a bunch of tests right away, but then your app changes and none of them make sense, and then you don't know where to go from there. And I think I find that's sometimes kind of like a breaking point where some teams just give up and they stop testing. So that to me is maintainability. It's not just doing it the right way once, but also continuing to do that. And so within Ember, and what I would like to focus on is just what are some of the challenges around that, and also what does Ember give us to help with that and to help us do that effectively. So the first challenge, I think, is querying the DOM. I apologize that I don't have like a presentation mode, but that's all right. Hopefully I don't get anything too bad. So first challenge is querying the DOM. It's kind of the age-old challenge that whether you're testing or just writing the app, I think it's something we all deal with. And whether you're using jQuery or the DOM API, there's certainly a lot of opinions out as to which one is better. It really, I think, it comes down to targeting selectors. So a selector being kind of, first and foremost, the CSS class. It could be a data attribute. It could be an element. And really, there are a lot of ways to do it, but they all come down to selectors. So the first approach that I find a lot of people tend to take is just match the markup. So you look at, I have this form card that I'm testing, and say it has a row of action buttons on the bottom, and then one of those action buttons is the submit button, which has a class of button primary. So I find that a lot of people will write their tests and they will use this syntax to find that button primary. And that works, kind of. You find what you're looking for, but what happens, say, if we have a designer come along and say, all of a sudden I don't want my submit button to be a button primary, I want all my buttons to blend in and have the same color, and we take off the button primary class for whatever reason. All of a sudden this test is going to break, and why would a test that is testing, say, the submit function of my app break because I decided to restyle my buttons? That shouldn't happen. So I find that the more and more you start to rely on just strictly going after CSS classes, more and more it feels kind of like walking in the middle of a maze, right? Like you find what you're looking for, and the app changes around you, you feel even more lost. So you realize that ultimately this maze just isn't meant for you. So it would be really nice if instead of walking into the maze, we had something like a magnet where we can stand outside of the maze and just pull out whatever we want without even going in, without worrying about the structure. And it turns out there's actually a method that magnet is called. It's called decoupling your data from presentation. It's called using HTML data attributes, essentially, particularly the data test attribute. This is a very common pattern really across any sort of testing, not just Ember. But it's a way of keeping the selectors that you use to find an element in your tests separate from a CSS selector that you use to style it. There's another similar approach too, which kind of involves separation of CSS classes from logic. If you're familiar with using like a JS class to find an element and then do something in JavaScript. This is kind of like that, but for testing. And it's a way to just keep everything out of the CSS completely and rely on data attributes. There's a really great add-on for that called the Ember test selectors. And it looks, so that this is what part of the app will look like if we're using Ember test selectors and data attributes. So we have this link to element, it links to a login page, and we just plop a data test sign link attribute on it. And then our test is as simple as importing the test selectors helper. And instead of writing in the CSS class, we use the test selector helper to generate, is kind of a nice little sugar over generating what that data attribute selector would look like. You could do this without using Ember test selectors, but I find that using Ember test selectors gives you a lot more out of the box. It gives you integration with components right away. So if you notice, this data test attribute is not on an actual HTML element, it's on the link to helper that Ember provides. And you would have to do some manual wiring to sort of bind that attribute with whatever component you were using if you wanted to come back and use that in your tests. Ember test selectors gives us that out of the box. And it also gives us attribute stripping out of the box. So if we create a production build, we can, and we don't want to have our actual HTML littered with test-specific helpers, all of that can just be removed. And Ember test selectors takes care of that out of the box. It also gives us a nice test selector helper. Usually, though, this is just the beginning. So we're comfortable finding elements, but in any sort of complex application, in any sort of ambitious application, there's usually a lot going on around async behavior. And the old Ember way for async behavior was something like this. So you'd have the click helper, which was Ember's built-in async test helper, and it would do, and it would simulate a click action, but it would be async aware. So any sort of asynchronous behavior in your application, would just be covered by the click helper. But in your test, you also have to make sure that you've matched it up with an and then helper, which will go in and it would run after your click action. And sorry, I'm not feeling that well.
That's enough for me.
Yeah. Some water.
Yeah. Drink some water. Have a sweet one. Every time. You have really good brownies as well.
All right, so this is our intermission.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, any question?
Yeah. I'm Stuart. I'm the technical lead here at Power Auctions. I don't do any Ember. I defer that to our experts. We have several guys around the room that do Ember full-time or part-time. We're basically rebuilding our framework from scratch, and we're decided on an Ember front end. I'm a long-time Ruby guy, Rails guy, so it made a lot of sense to me that for JavaScript, for any sizable application, you just can't throw JavaScript at it and end up with some mangled mess. So I really like the structure, and Chase and I met in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Chase used to work for HashRocket, and so he got heavily into Ember. For those of you that don't know Chase, he runs the Ember Weekend podcast. He decided to move away from the beach. I don't know why. He lives in Austin, Texas now. Anyway, yeah, so we're, beach, Texas. Anyway, we're sort of in development of redeveloping our framework, like I said, for our auctions. We do high stakes auctions, spectrum, electricity, natural gas. We do rough cut diamonds. The most recent big auction we did was for the FCC, which was the incentive auction where we bought back TV licenses from all the broadcasters, and then we packaged them and sold them as self-instructed. Small auction. We made a $7 billion profit for the U.S. government. As U.S. taxpayers, you may thank us.
You had me at diamond.
I had my wife at diamonds. And I said, you realize they're just rocks. Actually, there was a diamond auction this morning. Lots one at a time. So they were up very early this morning running or
Our auctions don't always run close to time.
We are worldwide. We do auctions all over the world.
Yeah. It's all based out of here. Sorry? It's all based out of this office.
It's based out of this office. Most of us programmers are remote. Each, again. Florida, Austin, Utah, Vermont.
If you see somebody under a beach with probably usually coding, totally one of our honest.
It was actually kind of funny. Like, oh yeah, we ran this, multi-billion-dollar auction for the U.S. government, Starbucks in Jacksonville Beach.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
We do the QA testing here. We do a lot of the client interface work out of here.
I'm sure with the federal government,
Oh, yeah.
it's going to be about a year.
That helps.
It helps. It helps.
All right. Good.
I think I'm good.
Good.
Awesome. This is actually like my first talk, so probably just not be embarrassed. It's like a trained skill.
You can always say, just read my blog post.
It is there, yes. All right, so again, this is just a very simple example of the old Ember way of using async test helpers, and it's pretty effective. But I think it runs into a lot of issues where the syntax is a little bit verbose, and you also kind of have to know, like, where do I put an and then, and where. It's one extra thing that someone has to learn when they're coming into an app for the first time. And I don't know off the top of my head if that had any, if the Ember run loop had any sort of intricacy with end then, but I know that personally I've struggled several times with mixing the run loop and then, and so naturally there's or so what I think we can start using instead of this pattern is sort of a newer Ember way. And interestingly, since Ember is kind of an SDK for the web, it's kind of the new web platform way involving async await and a nice little tool and the old click helper. You can import a click helper from Ember native DOM helpers, and instead of something that relies on jQuery under the hood, you get something that will give you a native HTML DOM element in return, which, again, I think that has a lot of benefits, but that's probably a much deeper subject. And you can use it in conjunction with async await, and so instead of using an and then helper in addition to the click helper, you can wrap this in an async function, put an await behind this, and the next line will only get executed after that async behavior returns. And as anyone who's looked at async await has probably already heard, it's extremely it's a much nicer pattern for writing your code synchronously, even though it's doing things asynchronously. And it makes it easier both to read and to write, and also a lot more approachable. And I found that I run into, and again, totally, this is just, for me, this is kind of still a bit abstract, but I find that it plays a lot nicer with the run loop. And I'm sure there's a lot more detail elsewhere on that. But I think more crucially, what this does is it allows the Ember core team to not focus on having to maintain a bunch of built-in async helpers, and someday not even rely on jQuery, and just focus on properly structuring their own the internal sequences of the framework, and letting you do things like this, and not having to worry about a ton of those internals. And so this gives us these two tools. We have a good way to query elements from the DOM. We have a good way to kind of control async behavior. Another tool that I found useful, I don't use it as much, but I still found it really useful, is drawing up assertions with custom test helpers. Dry referring to don't repeat yourself. And so Ember gives us a way to, I think there's a blueprint for this too, which I should have included, but there's a notion of a standard synchronous helper and an async helper that you can register, and you just register with the name of the function that you want to call in your test. And basically you define this function that, the syntax here is a little confusing in terms of what this function actually takes. I should include a usage example, but essentially it will take those last three arguments. When you're calling this function, it will take the selector, and it will take anything after the app and the assert. But it allows you to kind of, the same way we would import click from Ember test helpers, import should have element from your own set of test helpers. And so let's say you want to abstract the functionality of finding a list of elements and then counting those elements. You can do that by registering this test helper and then just calling should have element count with the selector with the expected count and with a context, which would also be optional, I believe, if find all just defaults to the whatever the dynamic is. And like I said, I don't find myself using this as much. It's kind of that old question of like how much duplication is enough before you start abstracting things, and is this level of abstraction worth doing that in your own tests? I think that's up to each of you and how commonly you're repeating things. But this is definitely a nice little thing to keep in your back pocket, I think. So all in all, this setup is really solid. I mean, we have a way to query the DOM. We have, again, nice helpers for everything. But it's really solid for integration tests. But when you get to acceptance testing, it tends to kind of be a whole other world. And that world, as it happens, is full of state. State that is inherently not necessarily easy to tame, but it wouldn't be easy to tame if you were doing this right out of the box quite yet. But if you're using Ember CLI Mirage, it becomes really, really well organized. And I would almost go as far as to say that Ember CLI Mirage is kind of like a critical tool to have in an Ember application. I don't know if I've writing a lot of Ember applications, I don't know that I ever really have an app that doesn't use Mirage. I know some people use Pretender, which it wraps, but I find that Mirage gives us, it gives us a lot. It gives us things like factories to, so if you have a data model and your data model is different properties, you can have factories that can be used for generating fake data, and they can take custom functions for kind of making that data generation dynamic. They can take a lot of really cool features built into Mirage around. There is things like traits. So if you have a factory trait, so if you can have like a user and then say this is a user and then a trait is a property that kind of defines, it could be like registered user, and only something with a registered user trait then will have the property of is registered set to true. You can attach a function to that says after this user is created, go and create a bunch of other models. Factories are really cool and really powerful. Fixtures are kind of a more static version of factories. It just is a way to define a bunch of fake data with a bunch of properties, but they don't really take functions or they don't really do anything dynamic. But they do have their use case if you're not looking to do anything really dynamic. And Mirage also gives us route handlers. So if we're making a request in our tests, we don't necessarily want to do it against a real server. We don't necessarily want to have to know exactly what the server is going to send back. So this is a way to mock out, and this is what is built on top of Pretender. It's a built-in mocking system essentially for intercepting your requests and then stubbing out responses. And then Mirage also has its own concept of models that really, they kind of go hand in hand with factories, but they control how your relationships are defined. So if you're relying on the model to have a has-been relationship to another model, you define those two models in your tests with a Mirage model and declare that. And the biggest thing for me on top of that is it's a memory database. And that gets back to taming the state that we were mentioning earlier. This allows us to, or Mirage allows us to go in and behind the scenes. So if you're familiar with a test in Ember, it will have a before each function. And Mirage wraps the for each function with a setup function for its in-memory database, and it makes sure that every test we're starting kind of starts from a clean slate. And this to me is really important because if you have a test, sort of just, maybe don't try to understand all of that, but pretend we have a test that is, you know, this is a test for a playlist model that contains a list of songs. And so you might have an acceptance test that goes in, or we can have an acceptance test that goes in and it creates our playlist model, it creates a bunch of song models, and then it goes and visits the route for that playlist. And doing this with Ember CLI Mirage means that we can write this test and on the very next test have no record of this ever having happened. And I find that that's really important in a lot of ways, but one being the fact that if you want to write another test that does things with song models or playlist models, you don't have to worry about the side effects that this test might have. And again, just to try and do that without a tool like Ember CLI Mirage, I think it's amazing just what amount of utility that offers. And it's probably saved a lot of people a lot of time. And so using Ember CLI Mirage for acceptance testing is the big tool that I find is really helpful. But how can we abstract these patterns a little bit further? If we have all these tools for querying, for controlling behaviors, for stubbing out fake data, is there some sort of almost like an API that we can use for just kind of placing this all in one place? And if I'm a new developer coming into the app, do I really have to know about all of these tools every single time I'm writing a test? And so what I found is that this is where the page object pattern comes in handy. And what is a page object? It's basically a good quote from one of the people who really wrote a lot of the original theory on page objects, Martin Fowler. It says that a page object wraps an HTML page or fragment with an application-specific API, allowing you to manipulate page elements without digging around in HTML. So still a bit hand-wavy, kind of. I find that to really understand page objects, I found that I really had to use them a lot to get a good knowledge of what they were. But essentially, what it is an API for acceptance tests. And it's a way to kind of have a separate test file that imports a page object and then just uses that object for different functionalities. And Ember CLI page object is the Ember version of that allows us to write something like this. And something completely separate from our actual tests, we can have something that is almost like a class, almost like a, it's very much like a class, but it's a separate object that contains properties, and it can also contain, mainly it contains properties that are also functions, where you can assign each property to a specific operation. So visit can be a visitable operation that visits a route. Username can be a fillable operation that fills an element with a selector that has any sort of selector you're using. And this is where we can start to see all of those patterns really start to come together, where if I have a username button or a username input on a form page, instead of writing a test that knows how to find the username input, knows to use Ember test selectors for that, knows what the test selector is, I can just encapsulate all of that once in my page object, use Ember test selectors there, maybe use Ember native DOM helpers there, although, and I think there's a story for actually doing that within Ember CLI page objects. but localize it in one place and then reuse this page object anywhere in my acceptance test that I'm working with, in this case, a user form. And so doing this, it's much, again, it cleans up a lot of things. It allows you to import this object in an acceptance test. And then where each of your acceptance tests might have looked like that one object that I showed, your acceptance test can look something like this, where you're using a chainable API to just fire off different functions: visit, username, password, submit, in a really clean syntax that is, again, I think it's a bit of a cognitive shift if you haven't used this. And at first I was kind of skeptical to, I think if you're a team that is used to doing all of kind of doing all of that specific logic in each of your tests, this is a little bit abstract at first, but I found this to be extremely helpful, not just for maintainability, but just going and writing a test with complex logic and chaining things together. So that's Ember CLI page objects. I think it's one of the more I think it's right up there with Ember CLI Mirage and something I would recommend using in any application. And yeah, so there are a lot of ways that we can go further. This talk could be twice as long. The article that I linked to was pretty long. So I'm
We'd
just
have to
gonna,
have another iteration.
well, no, and these are just some other links that I would recommend pursuing if you're interested in ways to just keep learning more about testing patterns. There's Ember Try, which again allows us to run apps or add-ons against past, present, and future versions of Ember, and kind of, if there's a change in a beta version of Ember that is going to break your app, you want to know about it right away. And Ember Try is a great way to do that, especially kind of in a separate. I find that it really comes in handy in CI, where maybe you don't want to run 5 different versions of Ember every time you're running your own tests. But when you're deploying stuff in a pull request, or when you're putting something out in a staging environment, that's where you can spin it off in the CI process that runs with the huge suite and may catch something in a later version of Ember and alert you that you're going to have to deal with this eventually. There's cross-browser and cross-platform testing with Sauce Labs. If anyone has used that, there's an excellent Ember CLI Sauce add-on that also helps this in Ember. And something that is probably the more recent one on this list is Ember Percy, which is visual regression testing. And that's a world unto its own that I personally plan to keep exploring, but I've heard some really great things about it. And basically it handles taking snapshots, visual snapshots and screenshots of your app as it would be rendered. And if, let's say you end up changing a border radius on a button, it will catch that and it will visually bit that, and you can set it up to alerts to throw a testing failure in your CI if it catches that. And so that's really the conclusion. I feel like I'm kind of just the messenger for this talk. I'm sharing a ton of great tools that other people in the community have put some great work towards. So just a huge thank you for me is owed to that and to them, and a thank you to you all for coming out.
Open up to questions.
Sure.
Comments. Discussion. Tools you guys are using.
Another add-on that's useful is Ember Exam.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I could have it.
Curiosity question. The one with the just doing theory, which is has to deal with things like dates and such that might be at straits, that might change.
I can answer that. It'll throw stuff. So if you're using something like Mirage, and Mirage has some tools you can use with it to kind of randomly generate names, you actually have to kind of lock those down, or else you just get all these false negatives on the
Well, it's
visual
fine with
regression.
names, but what about dates? Something you don't really have control over. Like you have a date on the screen. time
Well,
on the screen.
things both like names and dates that might change either programmatically or randomly. You just basically have to like lock them down. You basically just feed it. You kind of interrupt it and feed it consistent.
Does Percy not have the ability to like flag, like, I know this area is going to change and I don't care?
Not currently.
Really? Okay.
So like if you're using,
What's that?
you have to pay for the service. Yeah,
Yeah.
but if you're using factories, like you mentioned earlier in Mirage to generate your data, like in those visual tests, you would want to essentially hard code in, and it's pretty easy to override individual attributes and things in your factories. Say like John Smith instead of random first name, random last name.
How picky is the image comparison? Is
Incredibly
do you-
Yeah, it'll fail you for a single pixel.
Single pixel, yeah.
Yeah.
Before
Which
I find
honestly
browsers.
sometimes is been a lifesaver, where I haven't realized that something I did affected the border on something, somewhere I wasn't even thinking about, and it catches it, which is great. At first I was annoyed by it, I've grown to appreciate it.
We don't work for us.
Yeah. There's also some crazy options, but you can ask me about that after.
So that's the next talk.
That is a good question though, because I think something like a date might be more related to a value as opposed to visual style, and so that level of concern might be something that you would test with a component that renders a date, and you would test that. Given I'm rendering this component with this data, I'm rendering the date this way. But yeah, no, I would love to just spend a day or two digging into Percy, because I've heard some great things about it.
So everything you covered here like lives in Emberland, including like the mocking of the API and all that stuff. Do you have any thoughts on like you're doing an Ember app and a corresponding API that goes along with it? Like any steps that you can take to mitigate changes in the API from breaking stuff in Ember in production that won't get caught in a mock API test?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are you going to, so if I backend has a certain API and it has a certain data schema to it, if I change that schema,
Like a field gets removed on the back end.
right? I honestly, other than maybe testing, maybe, so one thing that I have seen done is pulling in the route handlers from Ember CLI Mirage. You can set up a route handler in any specific test, and that might be a way where you can just make a quick inline route handler that stuffs out a response that is different than your global route handler for that certain route. And if you want to stuff out a response that doesn't have a data attribute, that might be. I'm not sure if that is getting to what you were referring to.
I guess again, sort of asking about full like end-to-end testing, which is like slightly further than I guess what an Ember acceptance test normally be.
Right.
I personally have like looked into this for a long time and haven't found any super good resources or best practices on how to do that. So I was just wondering if you'd maybe dealt with that before.
Yeah, that's still an area where I'm a little vague on too. I'm not quite sure.
There are some tools I know. There's one, WatchCast, that does like
Nightwatch.
use Selenium.
Yeah, and anytime I've tried to do something there, it's not the best scenario. It's best for what you need, like as far as testing, but it's not the friendliest to the developer, because basically you have your full suite of Ember tests that you're running whenever you're making a commit, but then you also have a separate full suite of something that's ending up in Selenium, that's doing a full end-to-end test, that's running both when your API is changing as well as when your front end is changing. So it's a whole different coordinated suite.
Mhm. Right.
I haven't seen it where you only have one test suite that can do both yet.
So we kind of sidestepped like this whole problem, and it's probably not like too reasonable for everybody to do, but basically we have like a Java backend. The schemas are, by definition, you cannot remove fields from them, you can only add fields. So all APIs that you deploy with are guaranteed to be like backwards compatible. And we do, I think, we do different things. We don't deploy our like static assets separate from our like backend service. They get packaged together and then they're deployed all at once. So the client code and the server code that is like for that version get released all in one atomic commit into production. And that's like how we deal with a lot of like non-backwards compatible changes and stuff like that.
We ran into an issue just a few weeks ago where the front end was expecting a certain thing, and it changed, the test didn't catch it. I eyeballed it, saw it, and said, wait a minute, there's something in this column. And so we kind of rejiggered our tests a little bit, some code, so we have a better chance of catching it.
Is the what you talked about in terms of like locking the API so you can only move forward, is that something that's done programmatically or manually?
No, so we use we built our own like REST framework, and it's like I think it's built directly into the framework itself. And we have like crazy things, like we have like review for schemas and everything like that, stuff like that. And I don't know too much about it because I work on like fun stuff, but yeah, like that whole system's like open source and everything like that.
What's the?
It's called Restly. RESTLI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. For anybody else who's used Ember CLI Mirage, I haven't had an opportunity to introduce it on my project I just joined. So I haven't used it in a few months. I saw recently they added the ability for Mirage to look at your Ember data models for the relationships. Does that actually work?
I haven't tested that
Well.
out, but I think I know what you're getting at, right?
Because it seemed redundant to have to do all of my models twice. Use the relationship portion of the models for Mirage. So if that's, I saw that was added again. I want to say that was maybe a month or two ago. It sounds really cool. So I think quality of life improvements like that will make testing easier for all of us and more ubiquitous.
Yeah, yep, and there's another addition to that, I think, where before Mirage would make assumptions about I think it was your has-manings, where if you defined a has-maning on one model, it would automatically assume that the other corresponding model was a has-maning to the original one. And I think the newer version of Mirage cuts that out, and you have to explicitly define that, which I find really nice because sometimes you can have like a user that has many hosts. Maybe it was a has one. I think it was a has one where it would assume that if you has one or belongs to, it would make that a matching assumption. But sometimes you can have a user that belongs to a group within a group that has many users that doesn't necessarily belong to that user. So that's really nice.
It's also really good to deal your using it not just for testing but for development. When you're first, I guess, building your mock-ups, wireframes, whatever, rather than just some static data, having an actual fake API behind it that takes you 5 minutes to write versus the actual API with all of its proper logic that might take day or two because reasons.
Yeah.
And of course, it all line reloads like everything else in Ember if you're using Ember CLI, which is super cool.
Yep. Yep. I'm going to do a quick lightning talk for announcements as well. There were Ember 2.15.1, I think, it's a beta, the beta for Ember 2.15.1. It allows us to import node modules when we're doing app.import. So if you're building, it would be within the build setup of your app, where you would normally do app.import something from Bower components and then like 10 other steps for something in node modules. There's a way now to just do app.import from node modules. So that's awesome. A huge benefit. I probably learned how to do that myself like 3 different times. Still don't quite remember it, but that's going to be really nice.
That's all right. We go enjoy the food. Dessert.
company?
Thanks, kind of awesome.